It's my pleasure to again be talking to Bruce Beresford after our great chat with Anne Rapp about her documentary Horton Foot, The Road to Home. And Bruce, of course, features in that with his film Tender Mercies. But now we're going to be talking about, apart from other things, An Improbable Collection, which is also featuring as part of the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival. Bruce, welcome again to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you again. And this is quite an intriguing documentary about two artists who have an exhibition in the Mildura Art Gallery, Frank Brangwyn and William Orpin. How did this film, this whole thing come about?
Well, I'd been a fan of Brangwyn and Orpin for many years. And I'd, ever since I saw an Orpin picture in an exhibition in London in the 70s or late 60s. And then I thought, how could this painting, how could this painter be so great? And I've never heard of him. And then I started to chase him up. You see, I started to get information. And then I found out, of course, that Brangwyn and Orpin were for many years two of the most famous painters in the world, internationally known. Literally household names, but now completely forgotten. Well, then I found out in England, I bought some Brangwyn drawings and things, which are very cheap, of course, because nobody wants them. But one of the dealers said to me, oh, you know, there's a big collection of Brangwyn and Orpins in Australia in a place called Mildura. And I said, what? Not possible. And he said, yes. I said, but that's a country town out near the South Australian border. And he said, well, the collection is there, I'm told. Anyway, then I started to check it out. And of course, I found out that these pictures were bought by a wealthy Australian named R.D. Elliott in the 20s and 30s, and he shipped them back to Australia. Then he died in 1950. And by the time he was actually sick and dying, the painters were forgotten. See, they were world famous from about 1900 to about 1935. And then they were just forgotten. And so by the time he had all this big collection back in Australia, nobody wanted it. He offered it to the various galleries and they all said, no, these guys are a couple of hacks. So he left them to the Mildura Council and they're still in Mildura. I think they're both brilliant painters. And of course, I made the point in the documentary that the reputations of painters come and go. Look at Norman Lindsay in Australia. A few years ago, you could pick up a Norman Lindsay picture, a really big one, for like $100. Now they cost you hundreds of thousands because he's come back. The same with the Pre-Raphaelites. And of course, the same with people like Caravaggio and Poussin and, a whole lot of people. So anyway, then I thought, well, I'll go to Mildura and I'll make a film about Brangwyn and Orpin, basing it around the huge Mildura collection. Of course, I was interested in talking about the fact that reputations ebb and flow.
Certainly do. So how easy was it for you to make the film? Because it looks stunning.
Well, my daughter photographed it. She's a photographer. And we went to Mildura. We were only there for about a week. And we photographed the collection. And then I got other material. You see, we shot some stuff in London. We went to Belgium, where Brangwyn was born, in Bruges. We went and filmed a bit in Bruges. And to Dublin, where there was a statue put up of Orpin in Dublin. And then I had other material sent to me from America because Brangwyn did some very famous murals. He did the huge murals in the Rockefeller Center, the Herbst Theater in San Francisco, and various state capitol buildings. And I contacted all those people and they were very pleased to hear about the film. And they sent me photographs, sent me images that we could put into the movie to talk about them. And of course, we had a lot of historical footage. And I even found some old black and white footage of both of Orpin painting and of Brangwyn when he was very old, which is it was a real coup because I had been told by experts on both subjects that no actual movie footage existed of either man. But with some clever sleuthing, we found it.
Well done, well done. And it's a very crisply edited 28 minutes. I'm very impressed by that, but obviously you had much more footage than that, so the editing process...
Well,
yeah.
Yes. No, I had more footage, but I mean, you see, I said what I had to say in 28 minutes. You know, it was a bit of the story of, you know, these guys, their careers, the fact that they were so famous, and then their demise. I didn't really, you know, want to do any more than I did in the 28 minutes.
And the title is so interesting, and as you alluded to, An Improbable Collection, because you say they're out of favour pretty much.
Massively. In fact, when my daughter and I went to Mildura to do the filming, you see, the lady who ran the Mildura Gallery said to me, "Oh, look, let me give you a good date to come, because we're having a special exhibition of Brangwen and Orpin, and everything's on display. So we don't have it all down in the basement. We've got it all out. You can film it easily." Well, we were there for a week. Nobody came to the exhibition. Nobody.
Can you sort of pinpoint why they lost favour, or why they're not so interesting to artists or collectors or to the public anymore?
Well, of course, I think this could change. But I mean, it was, I did point out in the film that at one point I pointed out that Brangwen really was eclipsed by art critics, who then talked about the various trends, surrealism, abstraction, the various trends that had come in the 30s and 40s, that then really put the kind of figurative painting he did into the shade. And then, I mean, he didn't actually die till 1958, but I mean, everyone thought he was dead after about 1940, but he kept working.
Wow.
Still kept painting.
They're both going to be rediscovered, I'm sure, especially with your...
Well, I hope so. Well, I mean, I was very pleased when I heard about the statue of Orpin being put up in Dublin, which you actually see in the film. You see it being unveiled.
Yeah.
I mean, he was an Irishman. I mean, he was enormously celebrated. So the Irish, you know, they had no problem. They had no trouble getting a public subscription for the statue. And of course, the statue will stay there because he was not involved in the slave trade, and he didn't, although he got married a number of times, as far as I know, he didn't attack any young women.
Well, he's safe. Now, something else that intrigued me about your documentary is that you got Nicholas Hammond to narrate. Now, what a good voice he has.
Yes, he does. I wanted Nicholas because he's got a wonderful sense of humour, and I didn't want the narration to be one of those dry narrations for documentaries, and I didn't want it to sound too heavy. There's a lot of humour in the voiceover, and I thought that Nicholas's warm tone would be good for that.
It certainly is. And there's some nice music there by George Ellis.
Yeah, George wrote the score for the, he wrote it all. That's all written for the film.
Okay. Yeah. So how is the film being rolled out? Because obviously it's being screened at the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival, but where else?
Well, so far, Peter, as far as I know, nowhere else. I mean, I've sent it, I had a screening at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where it was very well presented on a big screen and very well received. And the gallery, they did a marvellous job in sort of promoting it. We had quite a few people along. And I've now, some people from the ABC came to see it and liked it. And they said, "Oh, you've not now send it to our acquisitions department," which I did. But so far I've not heard from them. And that was only, they've only had about 8 weeks to look at a 30-minute film. So I haven't heard back yet.
Oh dear. But it could also have currency in film festivals around the world.
Yes, I mean, I've been so tied up on other projects and scripts and things I'm trying to do that I haven't really sent it to any other festivals. And the other problem is I found they mostly want full length. If they want documentaries, they want full length ones. They want them of 90 minutes or so, you see, and it's quite short.
Uh-huh. Well,
So I don't know. I mean, I'll probably get it somewhere else.
yes. Well, it deserves to be screened elsewhere, but it's great that it's screening at the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival.
Oh yes, I'm thrilled about that. Yeah.
Bruce, just a few other things I wanted to talk to you about, because you have such a rich filmography, if you want to put it that way, with 2 Oscar nominations to your bow. Did those Oscar nominations for Breaker Morant and, of course, Tender Mercies, did that help or perhaps hinder your career in terms of developing films?
No, I think it helped to some extent. I mean, what it meant was that if I wanted some project, I was trying to get something going, people would say, oh, that's the bloke who directed that film that won the Academy Award, Driving Miss Daisy. I mean, it did help. It did help. It didn't mean that they suddenly rushed forward with truckloads of money and said, Bruce, do whatever you like. They certainly didn't do that. But it helped. The recognition helped somewhat, yes.
Interesting you mentioned Driving Miss Daisy. Didn't that have a tag attached to it to some extent? Here is the film that directed itself, because you didn't receive a nomination for it.
No, I wasn't nominated. No. That, of course, that has happened very occasionally in the history of the awards. There's been a very small number of directors whose film won, in fact, but they weren't nominated. It's kind of odd. Because one of the problems when Richard Zanuck was the producer, when we were trying to get the finance to make the film, a lot of the production companies and investors would say, well, it's quite interesting, but who could direct it well enough to sustain a film of 100 minutes? I mean, with only 3 people in it. They said it'd have to be superbly directed to make it work. It's so difficult to do it. It's much easier when you've got people crashing across the screen, shooting guns and all this kind of stuff. But to do it with just 3 people in a house talking, they said, who could direct that? I mean, you'll never be able to do it. So when I heard the film was nominated, I thought, the first thing I heard was that it had the nominations. And then I thought, oh, well, I'm bound to have been nominated because they all said how difficult it would be to do it. Then, of course, I found out I'm not nominated at all. I think I made it look too easy.
You phoned it in, as some people thought. Yeah, which of course is ridiculous, because you can't do that. When I look at your earlier career and how you were so important as part of the renaissance of the Australian film industry, and you look at things like Don's Party and Getting of Wisdom, I mean, you've made some fantastic films, Money Movers, The Club, of course. Would you say that the Barry McKenzie films were some highlights for your career?
They were, and they were great fun. The first Barry McKenzie film, which I loved doing with Barry Humphries, which we just thought was a lot of fun. I mean, and it was popular, but it had such bad reviews that I was persona non grata for a long time, because I'd sort of painted myself into a corner with a big sign that said total yobbo. And the funny thing was, I'd been in England before Barry McKenzie, making a whole lot of art films for the British Council, for the Arts Council of Great Britain. But of course, nobody knew that.
It's interesting when you make decisions about what films you make or write, etc. What's in the back of your mind? What's your process, I suppose, in making those decisions?
Well, there really isn't much of a process, Peter. I just get carried away with certain ideas or stories. You know, I'll just sort of find something that really moves me, and I'll think, God, that's a wonderful story. I want to tell that story to people. And then I'll just try and move heaven and earth to get it made. I mean, there's been a lot of projects that you know, I've been passionate about that I've never done. In fact, you know, just sitting over there in front of me, there's shelves of scripts that either I've written or people have written that they wanted me to film that have never been made, which is, you know, I think they'd all have made good films. We never got the money. But I mean, I've got the money for some. I have done over 30 films, so it hasn't been all bad news.
And it's so interesting about what films or what scripts get greenlit and which don't, and which attract funding and which don't. That's huge issue, isn't it?
You're right. It's a very weird situation. I've always thought there's a tremendous amount of whim involved. I know a friend of mine who worked for Disney for a long time in production. I said to him, how do they actually decide? And he said, well, everyone will be sitting around a table and they'll say, oh God, look, it's time for lunch. I mean, okay, that one, let's go. And they'll pick up stuff. And I said, it's capricious as all that. And he said, half the time, yes. He said, you never really know.
Wow.
So, you know, I often go to see films. Well, you know, I still go to see a lot of movies, and quite often I'll be watching some film and I thought, how could anyone have financed this? I mean, script is just terrible. There's a lot of good films too, but, you know, you get some films with truly abysmal scripts that have really got quite a lot of finance. There's a lot of it works too from connections, friendships, all that kind of thing. I mean, it's worked in my favor, I suppose, sometimes.
And your entry to Hollywood with Tender Mercies and working with Horton Foote, I mean, that was such a great experience, as we partly talked about in the interview with Anne. But working with Robert Duvall, working with Horton, and being able to really fashion such a beautiful story, even though, as you said, a lot of people didn't see it, at least not at first. It's been great for you, yeah.
No, that was lucky. I mean, I found out later on that they'd originally offered that script to about 30 American directors who'd all turned it down. They'd all thought the script was no good. And when I read it, I thought, who would turn this down? It's absolutely fantastic. Well, it did win the Academy Award for Best Screenplay. It was a wonderfully well-written script, but it had been turned down. And then evidently, someone said to Horton, look, there's this Australian bloke who's done a film called Breaker Morant that we think is good. Why don't we send the script to him? And Horton said, oh, okay, do that. And they did.
and it worked out terrifically. Did the film do better in America than it did in Australia?
Yeah, it didn't. I don't know if it was ever shown in Australia. I don't think it was.
I vaguely remember it having a limited release at one stage in the 80s, yeah.
No, it did. Oh, in America, it did quite well, and it's continued. That's gone on and on and on. You know, people keep screening it, and it's highly regarded. But no, it didn't do any good here, and it had horrible reviews in England. Terrible, which really surprised me. I thought, gosh, how could you give that really bad reviews? But they managed.
Well, that surprises me because it's such a beautifully observed a story, and as is typical of Horton Foote, that the UK, I would have thought, had a bit more nous than that.
That's what I'd have thought, but the reviews there were terrible. They were awful. No, I didn't like it at all.
Wow. And when you consider Horton Foote adapted Harper Lee's book, To Kill a Mockingbird, and did it so brilliantly.
Yes, he did. He got an Academy Award for that as well.
Yeah, yeah, and won a Pulitzer Prize and so on. So yeah, that's an astounding part, I suppose. The film world is never predictable.
No, I mean, Horton was a writer with profound character insights. I mean, he was just a wonderful observer. But you can't tell. I mean, it really didn't do that well, Tender Mercies, outside of the United States.
Yeah. Another one of your highlights, and I think you say this yourself as one of your favourite films, is Mr. Johnson.
Yes. Well, I think that's a really very good film. And that one came a cropper because black audiences in America were furious about it. Because I went to a screening quite early on. We had a test screening, and a lot of black people in the audience were angry, and they said, this black man is a slave to the white man. And I said, he's not a slave. I said, the white man is, it's said in 1923, I said, the white man is a sort of district officer, and the black man was a clerk working in the office. He's not a slave, he's working there for a salary. And also, it's a story of their friendship. It's not, he's not treated badly. I mean, anyway, the outcry was so colossal that Warner Brothers panicked and just withdrew the film and didn't show it.
Wow. And then we have a film like A Good Man in Africa, which you say is not one of your favourites.
Everything went wrong on that. It was filmed in the wrong place at the wrong time of the wrong people, and it all went. And it was adapted from a very funny novel that I realised when I was filming was very episodic. And the episodes are very funny, but it didn't really have a sort of thread through it. And I realised as I was directing it that it needed a much stronger narrative thread, and it wasn't there in the book. It's a bit like filming Evelyn Waugh. It's very, very hard to do because it's terribly charming, it's terribly amusing, but it's essentially episodic, which means that virtually all the films that have been done from Evelyn Waugh novels have really not worked, except for the epic novels like, the big trilogy set in West Africa during the war. Brideshead Revisited too, which was more of a narrative novel.
Yeah. Okay.
But Good Man in Africa was, I knew when I started directing it, I thought this is never going to work. I thought I'm the captain of the Titanic.
But you've had so many successes. And you mentioned this when we did the interview about Horton Foote, the documentary, Last Dance. That was, I think, a really good film.
Oh, the one with Sharon Stone?
Yes.
It didn't really work. It wasn't bad. She was good. Yeah. It just, nothing ever happened to it.
And you followed that up with Paradise Road, which, of course, was a very powerful and very successful film, I thought.
Well, it wasn't a big commercial hit, which we thought it would be, but it wasn't. I think people thought, because it was set in a prisoner of war camp, that it was going to be too depressing to bear. And I thought, and in fact, it's often quite funny. It's got a lot of, rather amusing moments, oddly enough, and good characterizations. But I think audiences felt it was going to be something of an ordeal rather than an entertaining film.
And yet an important and powerful one. Tell me about working with particular actors, because you've worked with so many over the years. You must have a preferred way of working with particular actors? Well,
I don't think I ever changed very much. I mean, I never hesitate to tell them what I think how the part should be done, if it's not quite the way I see it. I never walk up and say, well, that was lousy. What you've got to do is this. I'll walk up and say, look, what you've done is interesting, which it probably would have been. But the way I see it is such and such. And I usually find that, well, they're invariably very cooperative. They'll always do their best to, they'll listen and then they'll say, I see what you're after. Okay, well, we'll try that. That's usually their attitude. So especially the more famous they are, the more cooperative they are, I've found. And I've often thought that's why they're so famous, because they do deal well with directors and other crew people.
Okay. I really enjoyed Mao's Last Dancer, and that I think was such a well-directed film, had a good story, but it needed direction to it, I thought, that you did so well.
Yeah, it was quite tricky because it was full of non-professionals.
Mm.
Yeah, they weren't, I mean, the boy in the lead was a famous ballet dancer. He'd never acted. And there was a lot of people in it that they were dancers, they weren't actors. That was, they were good. They were very good.
And such a nicely observed film, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, you did that well. Now, I'm interested to know what you felt about directing a remake of Bonnie and Clyde.
Well, it's interesting you should say. It's not really a remake. You see, the original Bonnie and Clyde, which is a very engaging film and very charming, is essentially a sort of fantasy version of Bonnie and Clyde.
Mm.
I mean, not historically accurate at all.
Sure.
Not that that's a criticism of it, but it wasn't. And you see, so when the other Bonnie and Clyde script came to me, which was for television, I realized as I read it that it was actually ruthlessly honest. This was actually what happened to them. And I thought, well, it tells the story about the same characters in a completely different way. But of course, what happened when you try to promote a thing like that, everyone just says, oh, it's a remake of Bonnie and Clyde.
Right.
Not really. In fact, it's very, very different.
It certainly is, but of course...
No, it had been. The two writers in Los Angeles had done an enormous amount of research on what had happened to these two and where it had happened to them and all that kind of thing, which I found all fascinating. And I said to the producers, you better make sure when you're promoting this that it's perfectly clear we're not just remaking a Bonnie and Clyde for TV. I said, it's really quite different. That didn't work like that.
And I think I mentioned this at the Horton Foote interview that we did. Ladies in Black was such a lovingly observed film about a particular time in Australian life with such a good cast. You must have really enjoyed working with that script.
Oh, I did. I mean, you see, I was at university with the girl who wrote the book. She went and wrote 4 other novels. They're all wonderful. She died some years ago. And of course that era, I remembered very well. It was, 1958. I was 18 in 1958. I remembered it. And so it was great fun reproducing it all because I knew how to do it. It's not often you get to make a film where you know what it's like, Usually films like Black Robe or something, which is set in North America in 1629. I knew nothing about that. I spent a year just researching it. Yeah, but Ladies in Black, I knew. I knew where, they went here, they went to theatres there, this happened, that wasn't there, this was here, you have to have this, I knew the kind of cigarettes they smoked and everything. I said, get this brand and all that. I could, easy.
And you had such a great cast, including Julia Ormond, who I thought was terrific in the role.
She was very, very good. She worked very hard. Yeah, she did. She was, people assumed she was Hungarian or Croatian or whatever she was meant to be. Yes. Yeah, she was, again, she was based on a real character. In fact, the woman she was based on was, when we made the film, was actually still alive. And she came on the set.
Wow, that is so interesting. And did she give you any feedback or any comments?
I think she was kind of delighted that, she'd been put in Madeline St. John's book and now we were making a film and we were reproducing Grace Brothers and all that kind of stuff. It was all, I think she was thrilled.
Yeah.
She was pretty old, but she still seemed very smart.
Yes. So, Bruce, you were saying you're working on new scripts or a new film at the moment?
There's a couple of things. Yes, I've got a wonderful script by David Williamson called Nearer the Gods, which is about Isaac Newton, the scientist. And it's really one of the best things he ever wrote. And in fact, it's the only screenplay or plays ever written which wasn't set in Australia. I think. I don't think there was anything else that had a setting other than Australia. And he's done a marvelous job. We have an American company who want to do it, and we're in the throes of trying to get it cast and all the details. With the COVID thing raging around, it's not that easy. But the amount of Zoom calls and emails I've had are endless.
I can imagine. So, Bruce, how are you finding this new environment with Netflix, with streaming, with video on demand, with so much else happening, not necessarily in a cinema? Yeah.
Well, what it does mean is there's an enormous amount of production. So actors are really living in clover because the demand for actors is colossal. Every actor I know is tied up for years. You know, they often get a job at some huge salary on a series that's going to be done for 3 years. So there's a huge amount of work at the moment for them because of all of these, the Netflix and all the, you know, similar outlets. And the amount of production is staggering.
Does that mean it's easier for you, for example, as a screenwriter and a director, to be able to get more productions made?
No. It might help a lot of people. It hasn't seemed to help me, because I've said on various projects, let's get this to Netflix and see, because they could well be interested. And then the answer will come back, you know, no, Netflix aren't interested at all. So there's probably more places to try. But there hasn't been anything madly exciting yet. I mean, the David Williamson script, which I thought would knock them all sideways, they sort of take the attitude, well, nobody's ever heard of Isaac Newton anyway. And you know, it's about a scientist, and there's not a huge market for films about scientists. And in fact, you know, I keep pointing out that the script is actually terribly funny. I mean, Isaac Newton was such a wild eccentric that David has played this up very, very skillfully and got a lot of very, very good deft characterizations in it. But I think they just sort of think, oh, a film about a scientist, no, let's not get involved with that. There's one group that's interested, and we are trying to now get it moving.
Well, hopefully you can, because you also direct operas, and which intrigues me, like Girl of the Golden West, Electra, and I noticed you did a production of Sweeney Todd as well.
I did, yes.
It's so interesting to direct operas and musicals like that.
Well, I've always been very keen on operas, ever since I saw first one I ever saw when I was at school, when I was about 15. No, and I've just done Macbeth in Melbourne, the Melbourne Opera, yeah, and that was very successful. It's a wonderful opera. Of course, someone said to me, oh, you did a great job, and I said, well, so did Verdi. I think he can take most of the credit, because the music is absolutely devastating.
It is, but directing on stage and getting the movements right and everything, that in itself is quite a process.
Yeah, it is. A lot of work. It's a lot of work. It takes months before you start rehearsing. There's months and months of work, just, you know, working out what the set is like and how they move on it. Because I don't make it up as I go along. You know, I don't sort of get on stage and say, you go there and you go there. I don't do that. So I have it all planned. So dramatically, I know it's like puppets on a string. I know what I'm doing with it.
And I hope what happens when we talked about Horton Foote again, that some of his plays get produced in Australia, because it would be such a if it didn't happen.
It's never happened. I've tried hard to get some companies here interested in some of the plays, but it's never happened. Maybe, I mean, well, originally, you know, years ago when we were doing Driving Miss Daisy, there was a move. They were trying to get the play, the original play of that was done off Broadway, and then we thought, the producers thought, you know, it would go well in Australia. There was no interest whatever. The play, in fact, was done in Australia after the success of the film. And initially, they didn't, people read it and turned it down.
Amazing, amazing stuff. Well, I'm glad to say that your short documentary, An Improbable Collection, is screening as part of the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival. And I wish you well with the David Williamson script. I hope that works out.
Oh, so do I. Yes. Thanks, Peter.
Pleasure talking to you, Bruce Beresford.
Okay.
Thanks again.
All right.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye-bye.